Everyone has their take on the Indian Wars, and virtually all of them are controversial. The left says settlers were racist, genocidal land thieves. The right says they were heroic pioneers just defending themselves from uncivilized savages. But what if I told you they're both wrong? History isn't a simple story of the good guys and the bad guys. It's a story of incentives. And once you understand those incentives, the Indian Wars stop looking like an inevitable clash of civilizations and start looking like what they really were, a shift in economic logic that made war more profitable than peace. I recently read a paper called Raid or Trade, an economic model of Indian-white relations by Terry Anderson and Fred McChesney, and it breaks down something most historians ignore. Violence didn't happen just because of racism or manifest destiny. It happened because of economics. For a long time, settlers and natives coexisted peacefully. Why? Because trade was more beneficial than conflict. Settlers had guns and tools. Natives had furs, foodstuffs, and land. Both sides had something to gain, while war was expensive and, quite frankly, risky. But incentives don't stay the same forever. Eventually, things changed. Land became more valuable, governments got involved, and the cost-benefit analysis shifted from trade to raiding. And ironically, one of the biggest things that fueled this conflict wasn't the settlers themselves. It was the US government protecting them. Sounds crazy? Let's break it down. If you believe the Hollywood version of history, settlers and natives spent every waking moment trying to kill each other. However, in reality, they were both just trying to mind their own business most of the time and traded with each other when it would benefit them both. In the 1600s and early 1700s, European settlers weren't exactly in a position to start wars. They were outnumbered, unfamiliar with the terrain, and completely dependent on native trade networks. Colonies like New France and New Netherland thrived because they didn't fight the natives, but instead worked with them. French traders built a massive fur trade by allying with the Huron and Algonquin against the Iroquois, while the Dutch in New York made deals with the Mohawks. The Pilgrims didn't make it through their first winter because they were rugged frontiersmen. They made it because the Wampanoag helped them farm and hunt. Even the Virginian settlers, despite their frequent conflicts, depended on the Powhatan trade for food. For many tribes, on the other hand, trade was a way to gain power. By the 1600s, the Iroquois Confederacy was fully integrated into the European economy. They used Dutch and later British guns to wage the Beaver Wars, wiping out rival tribes and monopolizing the fur trade across the Great Lakes. Or the Comanche. They adopted horses from the Spanish, and they became the best horsemen on the continent. They controlled trade routes stretching from Texas to Kansas, selling horses, bison hides, and captives to the Spanish, French, and later, Americans. Then there's the Choctaw and Chickasaw, who played the British and French against each other in the southeast. They traded deer hides for guns and iron tools, but more importantly, they played both sides depending on which direction the wind was blowing in. That is to say, when the British and French fought in North America, these tribes picked sides based on who offered the better deal. Even smaller tribes benefited. The Ojibwe, for example, gained access to firearms through the French and used them to push the Sioux out of their lands in Minnesota. The Plains Cree became middlemen in the horse and gun trade, supplying other native groups across the Great Plains. So even though the natives might have been fighting against each other, the settler-native relations stayed mostly peaceful, and trade was preferable to conflict in the vast majority of cases. But this system only worked as long as both sides found trade more beneficial than conflict. And that's what changed. As settlers pushed further west, something changed. The further they moved from the settlers' colonies of the east, the harder it became to make land deals that both sides actually understood. Why? Because not all tribes saw land ownership the same way. Eastern tribes understand land sales, but the Western tribes did not. In the East, tribes like the Cherokee, Creek, and Iroquois had long since adapted to the European-style land ownership. Most had permanent villages, farms, and clear territorial boundaries. When settlers wanted land, they could negotiate with tribal leaders who had the authority to sell it. In exchange, the settlers would have to give up guns, tools, or whatever else the natives were willing to negotiate for. Deals were made, payments were exchanged, and, at least in theory, both sides walked away satisfied. But as settlers moved west, they ran into nomadic tribes, the Lakota, Comanche, Cheyenne, and Apache, whose societies weren't built around the concept of owning land. To them, land wasn't something you sold, because it wasn't something you owned in the first place. The nomadic tribes lived by hunting over the vast American prairie, and so didn't value any individual piece of land, and it was impossible for the settlers to negotiate the rights over land with tribes to whom the idea of drawing a line on a map and saying, "This part is ours permanently," didn't make sense. So when US officials showed up offering money, goods, or treaties in exchange for land, many of these tribes didn't see it as a permanent transfer. They saw it as a temporary agreement, a right to use the land, not own it forever. Meanwhile, the settlers thought that they just purchased it outright, and you can see where the conflict started. This led to constant misunderstandings. Settlers would move in, believing they had the legal right to the land, while native tribes saw them as trespassers. But don't get it twisted. It wasn't just in the West that war became preferable to trade, but something changed in the East too, and that something was the United States government. At the start, settlers had to own the risks of their actions. If they broke a treaty or stole land, they had to deal with the consequences, often in the form of retaliation from a tribe that wasn't going to let it slide. This kept expansion in check. It made settlers think twice about starting unnecessary conflicts. Of course, this went for the natives as well. When you have to take on the full risk of your decisions to go to war and defend yourself along with your buddies in case of war, you will try that much harder to maintain peace, because war could mean the death of you and/or your loved ones. You will respect treaties you agreed to, and you will not encroach on territory that isn't yours for fear of reprisal. That changed when the US government grew in power and created a standing army. Economics can explain armed conflicts as follows. If a side believes it has more to gain from armed conflict than it stands to lose as a result, and if those gains can offset the cost of armed conflict, it will initiate that conflict. Again, this is why peace often prevailed. You'd rather trade with your neighbors than shoot them and risk being shot back. But this changes once you add a standing army to the mix. The cost of mustering a standing army and building fortifications is great. However, once that cost is paid, the cost of fighting is very small. In other words, it costs a lot to raise an army, but once it's already raised, it doesn't cost all that much more to send it off to fight, and this changes our conflict equation. Suddenly, when settlers gain access to a standing army that is there to defend them, their personal costs of initiating a conflict are heavily reduced, because it is not they who will have to bear the personal cost and risk of fighting the natives. If John the American decides to move into territory that the Indians see as their own before any kind of treaty was signed, and thus initiates a conflict, and if the natives decide to attack him as a result, he will run to the United States Army for protection, who will then fight his war for him. Once the US Army has won, John the American will once again be able to move into the newly US territory. And if the US Army loses the war, well, it wasn't John who was fighting anyways, so no big deal. The government had essentially socialized the cost of war while privatizing the benefits. Individual settlers got the land while the entire country paid for the fighting. Individual settlers could start wars that all the other taxpayers would have to pay for the benefit of those individual settlers that, even if won, likely would result in much smaller gains for the US compared to the money that was spent to achieve them. But the fact that all the US was losing money didn't really matter to the individual settlers because they wouldn't feel that on their own skin. They would only feel what they stood to gain or lose, and with the potential for substantial gains and very little losses, war becomes a logical choice. And now, there also isn't really incentive not to commit horrific crimes against your enemies, because you won't suffer the consequences of the natives becoming even more violent. It will be the army that is fighting your wars for you. And that is how wars are about economics just as much, if not even more, than they are about anything else. And when we're trying to explain the causes of conflicts around the world, it'll be far more useful to look at the economic incentives affecting each of the players involved, rather than relying on blanket assertions like racism or ideology. And with that, thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this one, and I hope to see you in the next one. So don't forget to subscribe.